I would want to jump off a bridge if I spent 12 years talking to some dickhead about all the bad things that's happened in my life. It's detrimental. Sitting there crying about bad things is never going to help you. If you're the kind of person who feels like they need therapy, you need someone to talk to make me feel better. Do you know what you are? You're useless. Because in the harshest realities of this cold world, there are people in Syria whose entire families have been blown to fuck with a bomb from the sky, who are still getting up every day, making fucking bread and selling it on the streets so they have enough money to buy a new pair of sandals sometime next year. While you're crying about fucking nothing with your first world bullshit to some dickhead therapist who probably does coke on the weekends. Another thing therapists do, you'll notice, they talk in riddles. They speak in riddles. Well, why do you think that is? The reason they speak in riddles is because they don't tell you anything. They ask you questions. Because if they ask you questions, they can never be wrong. If they tell you things, they're wrong. If you sit there and go X, Y, Z, and they go, oh, that's because of X, Y, Z, then you can say, no, it's not. Fucking moron. I'm out of here. But if you go X, Y, Z, and they go, and how do you think X is related to Y?
Why does he say
Then you talk for another 20 minutes. That's another hour burned. Burn that time up. Keep paying the fucking bills. They don't say anything of relevance or anything of merit because they can be used against them. They don't want anything used against them. They just want you to fucking sit, chat shit. It's garbage.
Right. So, I mean, he has a point, right? He does have a point. Just like with a lot of these, you know, popular influencers online, it often does start with some kind of grain of truth, but it just gets so muddled and wrapped up in so much falsehood and nonsense, really. And that's what's happening here, because he does have a few poignant observations that I do think are valid, but he just, on top of that, just says so many invalid things and incorrect things as well. I think I'm going to just have to make a separate video addressing all of them. That's kind of the problem with fact checking and giving rebuttals, is that like all they have to do is like just say one small thing, and then you have to kind of dissect it and spend so much time refuting it. So today I'm just going to address like one particular part of this video. And that would be, I think it's somewhere around
to make me
here.
feel better. Do you know what you are? You're useless.
Yeah, this.
Bomb from the sky, who are still getting up every day, making fucking bread and selling it on the streets so they have enough money to buy a new pair of sandals sometime next year. While you're crying about fucking nothing with your first world bullshit.
Yep, right here. So essentially the argument he's raising here is, who are we, you know, us as these like privileged, developed Western nations, who are we to complain about any strife that's going on in our life, and depression and anxiety and any other kind of disorders, when all of these countries in the Middle East or in South America or Africa, they're dealing with much, much worse conditions, but they don't seem to be reporting as much mental illness. Mental health isn't as big of a thing there. So why is that? That's essentially the question I just want to answer today, because there's a lot of reasons for why that is. For one, it's not even entirely accurate to suggest that mental illness isn't present in Syria or whatever country he mentioned, or any of these other low-income countries. That's just not entirely accurate. Part of the reason why mental illness is maybe less prominent in these countries is because it is less reported, it's less often diagnosed. And why is that? Well, turns out that low-income countries have a low amount of income, right? Makes sense. So if you don't have the finances and the resources necessary to administer these diagnostic tests and actually train these specialists in order to diagnose individuals, then yeah, you're going to report fewer cases of depression, right? But that's not something to celebrate. That just means that you couldn't even afford to adequately recognize and treat your population. This quote right here: global expenditure on mental health is less than $2 per year per capita, less than 25 cents in low-income countries. That's pretty small, guys. I don't think you need me to tell you that. So when you're working with pennies, with cents for a person's mental health, you really think you're going to be able to afford, a therapist or a psychiatrist to diagnose millions of individuals? Of course you're not. Right. And this is just one of the many reasons. I think this is challenge two. if you all want to check out this paper, it's Mental Health Service Provision, Low and Middle Income Countries. And there's the authors. I highly encourage you to read it for yourself. Um, some of the other reasons that have been cited before as to why underdeveloped nations have less mental illness is partially because of a cultural reason, right? You know, newsflash, languages and cultures differ between countries, and not all languages are going to have the same um, way of describing or identifying something like mental illness, right? And so if you don't have a concept of what psychosis means uh, in the way that us Westerners conceive of it, then it's going to be pretty hard to diagnose that in your countries as well. Um, Literacy rates and numeracy rates, right? In order to report uh, nationwide statistics on your country, you're going to have some pretty good, you know, literate individuals. But unfortunately, in some of these countries, their education is not as standardized. And unfortunately, literacy and numeracy rates may not be as high. And so it's kind of hard to work with stats and kind of hard to report on millions of cases of mental illness when so many of so much of your population wouldn't even know how to. There's a few other reasons as well. I'm sure they've talked about, I'm sure someone's talked about extreme taboo surrounding mental illness. If you think mental health is surrounded by taboo here in America, man, try living in some of these countries. But like it's some of the accounts from some of these communities is I'm let's just say I'm glad that I'm very fortunate. I think a lot of us are. So yeah, I highly encourage you guys to check out these resources. This is another one that I was just reading through today. Um, Pretty good stuff. So all that is like factual. Let me just move this over here. Okay. But yeah, everything we've talked about, pretty factual, objective data that we have that provide some pretty good reasons um, that answer Andrew Tate's question, that kind of refute his argument that mental illness just doesn't exist in these countries. Um, so I feel like all of that's pretty adequately addressed, but something I really want to talk about today as well was my own personal hypothesis. So just so you know, this is not something that I've tested. This is not something that's scientific. This is just like kind of my own little theory that I've been kind of playing around with recently. And I think that part of the reason why um, part of the reason why underdeveloped nations may not experience as much mental illness as our countries is I think that sometimes, in some cases, humans are better at adapting to extreme changes from baseline as opposed to minute changes in baseline. So what do I mean by that? Have you all like, does anyone know what it's like to be in a mildly cold room? For me, it's torture, and it's that weird limbo between like 66 and 70 degrees. It's just absolutely awful for me. I usually feel worse. I'm almost always gonna feel worse in an indoor room at 67 degrees Fahrenheit than I would outside at 50 degrees or 40 degrees. I don't know why it is. I just am like so uncomfortable when the indoor temperature is like slightly cold. And I think it's because something like 67 degrees is for me that perfect balance of discomfort where it's definitely not a warm temperature, but it's also not cold enough to kick your body into gear for your sympathetic response to actually like work and keep you warm. It's like this delicate balance of perfect discomfort. And I feel like something similar can be said for emotions. On the extreme end, you know, when your neighborhood is war torn, when you can't access food or water or shelter easily, existential dread and the meaning of the universe is probably the last thing on your mind. Your body doesn't want to think about any of that right now because it doesn't need to. What it has to focus on is more important things like where am I going to find food for the night? Where are the bombs going to drop today? What is my family going to do? You know, whereas if you're in a Western civilization and you're at this cushy academic university institution, you can afford to have existential dread. You can afford to fixate on your anxieties. You have the time and the bandwidth to do so. And it's an especially frustrating process to deal with because it's like most of these things that we deal with that we're anxious about are not life or death situations, right? The things that we're anxious about are what grade am I going to get on this test? You know, when is my boyfriend or my girlfriend going to text me back? What is the meaning of all this work that I'm doing? What's my purpose? So it's very frustrating because you're right on the cusp of this balance in life where you're not comfortable or rich enough or fulfilled enough to have zero worries in life, but you're also not so overwhelmed by the extremities of life that you're not preoccupied scrambling to survive, right? So you're just kind of like in this middle weird limbo of discomfort, this perfect balance of stressors. And I really, really do think that that at least partially contributes to what we're seeing today. Um, because I think that when your back is against the wall and you know all cards are out on the table, the only thing on your mind is to survive. And sometimes that can overcome or suppress certain mental illnesses. I definitely agree. But that doesn't mean that mental illness does not occur in these countries. And that also doesn't mean that, and that doesn't negate the validity of therapy either. So yeah, that's all I want to talk about in regards to this. Let's move on to the next video.